Wow, that is a lot of Trundle Lysandra control. I guess at this point we've officially crowned a new king of anti-aggro. Nevertheless, let's take a trip down memory lane and look at the previous king of anti-aggro in Fior Shin. How many people played that? A measly two. A measly two people played Fiortion this past week. Yes. Hold on. Come on, you guys, join me. Let's give a round of applause to our dev team for Legends of Runeterra for getting this incredibly toxic card the heck up out of here. Thank you, devs. Much appreciated. Much appreciated. Bravo. How's it going, YouTube? It's your boy Optima, back with a brand new episode of Meta Assessment, and this is a series where we do deep dives to ensure the meta thrives. And exactly what I mean by that, in case you're curious, is just that we use actual data from tournaments, the real competitive scene, rather than ladder data to evaluate exactly where the meta is trending, what's working, what's not working, and just exactly where things lie week in and week out. There's a vast amount of solid resources in the Legends of Runeterra community for evaluating stuff, but very few of them really evaluate ladder data in the way that we're attempting to do so in this series. So hopefully this can be a helpful resource, continues to be a helpful resource for the community moving forward. And just to kind of hammer that point in a little bit more, I just quickly want to go over to Mobalytics. I would argue probably the most used resource in the Legends of Runeterra community as far as just kind of getting a perception of exactly what the meta for Legends of Runeterra is. And one thing you'll notice right away there is there's a ton of iterations of Thresh Nasus that are doing well currently on ladder. And while Thresh Nasus has some pretty alright numbers as far as how many people are using this deck in tournaments, nevertheless it is not dominating the tournament scene in any shape, way, and form in the way that it is currently on ladder. And this is going to be in the Masters and Diamond rank only, because I would say the average player who enters a tournament is probably somewhere around there. And yeah, it's just that's not what's occurring in the competitive scene. And we even see a lot of as Draven, two different iterations of as Draven. And while a very good deck that saw a huge uptick this past weekend in prevalence, it's still also not dominating in that same way in the competitive scene as it is on ladder. And the two decks that are currently dominating a lot, that are kind of separating themselves from the pack, are going to be Aurelion Sol Demacia and then the Trundle Lysandra control deck. And we don't see Aurelion Sol Demacia until the 10th slot as far as win percentage on ladder. So that's obviously not as accurate as it's not just true to the competitive scene. And then out of the top 27 decks in Diamond and Masters as far as rank, we don't see as far as win percentage, we don't see Trundle Lysandra control at all. So it just goes to show you that there's a cap on how much you can really get from ladder data as far as understanding what's going on in the competitive scene. So definitely a series meant to just paint a more clear picture of the meta at any given time. So if you guys definitely want to support this series, if this sounds like something you'll enjoy, I would definitely appreciate you watching the entirety of today's video, especially because we have an amazing guest, someone who I have a ton of respect for in the Legends of Runeterra community. They have a vast amount of knowledge. You can find plenty of deck guides on their YouTube channel, as well as a very fun personality that you can see quite frequently on stream. There'll be links to all their socials in the comment section below, so definitely I would highly recommend getting over there and showing them some love. Yeah, if you want to support the series as well, make sure to leave a like on the video, and even more importantly, leave a comment in the comment section below so that the conversation, the discussions on the meta don't end at the end of this video. We can continue things in the comment section below. Let's hop into today's video.
I actually main decked when I was playing this deck. Uh, oh, the Ezreal's level too. I actually like. Wait. Yo, watch this, guys. I'm gonna level up Ezreal, and then Voice of the Risen's gonna activate. I'm just like kind of DMing here. I think the correct play was always to open attack, or at the very least just play Farron. But like, how can you resist this play? So like after expansion hit, I was kind of messing around with Zoe Yasuo a little bit. I mean, to anyone thinking, oh, how did it turn out? I think the answer is a little bit obvious there, but I did try out like having a Sleepy Trouble in there. I don't think it was great though. So he's gonna play Serpent here, we're gonna try Demon.
Once again, I couldn't be more excited to have the personality we have with us today. It's going to be none other than the #1 Yasuo supporter enthusiast. That is going to be Jasensational. How's it going, man? Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us on Meta Assessment. And yeah, how's it hanging?
Hey Optima, it's going great. We got some really exciting data to look at, so I'm really excited to get forward with it.
Heck yeah, thank you so much for joining as always. As he said, we got some awesome stats. You guys can see them on screen right now. As this weekend we had the Twin Suns Open Top Cut, which was conducted. Obviously, do keep in mind that this was the top cut that was coming over from last week's overall tournament. So none of the competitors in the top 16 were able to switch any of their deck lists. So that may have factored into how that kind of played out. We do have the Escala Open 21, the Duels of Shurima 2, which obviously was a very large tournament. The Ween Mental Warfare #2, the RLOR Season 6, Week 6, I think that's what that stands for, Slot B. And then we got the awesome totals of having this all together. So yeah, just a ton of stats to look at. And I think no other way to start this off than asking you, Jay, what exactly stands out to you when you first give all of this data a look? I know it stands out to me, but I'd like to hear your opinion first. What exactly is really just kind of gathering your attention when you first give this a look?
For sure. I think the first thing that stands out is definitely the just sheer amount of different decks we see. I think in the past it's kind of boiled down to maybe like the top 2, top 3 decks that you kind of expect going around here, but I think there's a much more even spread of decks throughout. Like sure you have the top 3 decks that have been the most popular. Besides that, you have like 10 different decks that all have some pretty decent representation throughout all the different tournaments this week.
Yeah, that was something I noticed for sure as well. On my end, is that it actually feels like we're in a meta where there's adequate answers to even the most, I guess, quote unquote oppressive decks. It really doesn't feel like we have a truly super oppressive deck right now, and I feel like that's why we're able to see the meta being a place where it seems really healthy. There's a decent bit of options to use, and yeah, like you said, there's definitely those like kind of decks that are pulling away from the crowd, but nevertheless, it's not staggering enough to where it feels like you can't still try with other different archetypes, different ideas. So yeah, I'm very excited, and that was like the biggest thing that had me excited this past weekend was just how many decks seem to be able to kind of hold a little bit of their own in this meta. It's really awesome to see. And especially the different iterations of them as well, because it's like one deck that you guys can clearly see a lot of right away is Aesol Demacia, but especially with me recording all these deck lists, putting them into this spreadsheet, I noticed so many different iterations of Aesol Demacia. Like this is a deck that people are building in so many different ways, and that can be said to a lesser extent about TLC, even Trundle, Lysandra Control. So yeah, definitely really cool to see. Things aren't as straightforward as they've been, and it seems like maybe we did get a really solid patch recently. Our first patch of the stream expansion. Maybe it actually accomplished what it meant to accomplish. The meta seems very open. From there, I just wanted to do a little bit of discussing of obviously the biggest tournament that we had this weekend, which was the Duels of Shurima 2. It had over 190 participants and not 192 from what I was able to record. And this is not all of the deck list stats. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of some issues with the Decks of Shurima website where it just was not recording like the last 40 to 50 decks at all. Like they just would not show up. Just said an error every time. So my apologies there. But nevertheless, I think this still pretty much is consistent with what we were going to end up with. Just probably like an increase in all these numbers, but at the same time, I don't think these numbers would have been much different. And yeah. What exactly, when you first give that a look, what stands out the most to you, Jay, out of the
Yeah, for
Duels of
sure.
Shurima decks?
I think that especially because the Duels of Shurima tournament was this weekend, me having played a decent amount of ladder in the past few days, I think the meta and the decks that people brought to this tournament are highly reflective of what I've seen on ladder. So of course, you see a lot of TLC, you see a lot of Asol, and you see a lot of Draven Ezreal, which is the slow burn deck. And then you see pretty much like everything else here. So I think very reflective of what people are playing on ladder and bringing into into the tournament. And of course, the top decks being TLC, Ace of Demacia, and Draven Ezreal as the most bought decks doesn't really surprise me much there.
Yeah, me either at all. That's definitely some of the exact same decks I was facing on ladder, and I actually, I saw a lot of slow burn starting to creep up. It crept all the way up to the third most used deck this weekend. So I would like to hear a little bit of your opinion on that deck. Do you think the hype is for good reason? Do you feel it's a little bit more of a ladder deck? How do you feel about slow burn in the meta right now, especially the tournament meta?
Yeah, definitely. I played a lot of Ezreal Draven on ladder as well myself in the past few days, and I've done, I'd say, remarkably well with it. Now, of course, it's not the same to do well with it on ladder versus doing well in a tournament, but I think just looking at a matchup standpoint, Draven Ezreal doing decently well into Ace of Demacia, doing decently well into most of the popular aggro decks like Nightfall, perhaps Discard, and maybe like Spider if they don't get like a really, really strong hand. I think there are some potentially good matchups for Draven Ezreal and not too many bad ones per se. It's kind of like a pretty smooth deck in the meta. It's not like super strong into too many decks, but it doesn't really have any gaping weaknesses either. And so I think it has seen a pretty good uptick with it to kind of balance out against the Ace of Demacia decks. Now, to kind of counteract that, I think that its performance into like a lot into like maybe like a lot more Targan, maybe in like the top cuts, or just playing into better players. I think that it might drop off a little bit there because I think Draven Ezreal is a very good deck to take advantage of players who might not know how to play around it the best, or just kind of play at a slightly lower level.
Yeah, that's very fair. I will say, even when I experimented with different archetypes with Ezreal, he definitely seems like a champion that isn't as straightforward as a lot of other ones. So, especially with it being slow burn, so using a typical aggro champion like Draven, but using him in a deck that wants to take things a little bit slower, I could see a lot of players maybe playing a little too aggressively early on and then kind of not having the resources that they need later game, or kind of using all their burn, like just using all of their mystic shots or whatever, get excited, send two cards that aren't as significant as they think they are, and then in the late game they don't have what they exactly need. So yeah, I think it's a deck that has kind of a high, or at least a low, like the skill floor for it is actually kind of high. And obviously the potential's there. I agree with you completely, is that it kind of easily removes a lot of those aggro champs and those aggro threats, so while also leveling Ezreal, which is once Ezreal's leveled, he's a very very scary champion. So yeah, I think it has its place in the meta for sure, and I see why a lot of people favored it this weekend. But nevertheless, we did only see three of them make it into the top cut of Duels of Shurima, whereas decks like Lee Sin, Zoe saw four, even Discard, Spiders. Discard had five, Spiders four, Acel, Demacia, and TLC at five. So maybe players will have to go to the drawing board a little bit more and just figure out exactly how to pilot that deck, because I don't necessarily think it's overrated, but I think people don't realize how exactly to pilot it maybe at this point. But we'll have to see exactly how that ends up trending moving forward. Definitely a deck to keep an eye out for. I think for sure, just when you see just such a staggering increase from one weekend to the next, that's definitely a deck to keep an eye out for. Other things I would say that I've noticed when looking at this is that obviously it's just you can't go without talking about it. TF is only 6 decks in the Duels of Shurima, and overall we only saw 8 in total, out of all these different tournaments we have here. And then obviously Fiora Shin, that deck has saw no one play it, at least from what I was able to record. There was the few decks that didn't get recorded from Duels of Shurima, but from what I was able to record, no Fiora Shin. And overall, at the end of the day, we only had about 2 Fiora Shin decks. So yeah, I also have to ask, what do you think that patch accomplished what it needed to do? Our first patch of the Shurima expansion, we're seeing a lot less TF and we're seeing a lot less Fiora. Did those just very minor changes actually cause these champions that were so oppressive prior to it to really kind of fall off a cliff?
Yeah, that's a great question. For Fiora, Fiora's reputation herself has declined sharply, and that is reflective of her nerf. I think the 1 health difference just really hit the champion as a whole. But we've seen people shift away from Shen Fiora into more of the Shen J4 deck, which is pretty much the exact same deck. And Shen J4 still had a decent representation, at least within Duels of Shurima this weekend.
Yeah.
So the archetype as a whole is still very much alive. Of course, just shifting away from Fiora as a champion into more of like a J4 kind of deck.
Yeah, that's very fair. What are your thoughts on TF Fizz?
Yeah, I think TF Fizz is kind of in a weird spot. Of course, its power level got significantly decreased from the nerfs, but I think it still holds some decent matchups. I just think that it falls into the same bucket as Zoe Lee. Both two very strong decks that don't see a lot of play. They're good into Aesol Demacia, they're good into Draven Ezreal, but I think they're being held back by a lot of people just on like triple aggro lines. Like you see a lot of aggro decks, a lot more than I thought. There'd be Nightfall aggro's up there, Thresh Gnosis is up there, Discard Spiders is up there. Even Scouts can do pretty well into Zoe Lee and TF Fizz. And so that we do see kind of like a rock, paper, scissors where maybe some of the better counters for decks like TLC, Aesol Demacia are being held back by these triple aggro lines.
Yeah, and that's very very fair. I feel like we've been seeing pretty much since the patch a lot of people favoring those triple aggro lines, and when you can obviously only ban one of those decks, you're going to have to face the other two, and it could just be really difficult to play some of these decks into those lineups. And I feel like that's probably the number one reason why we see so much TLC. It being, I feel like, the king right now of control. With just having so much removal and then having what feels like one of the best late game strategies with getting the Watcher down. So since we're already transitioning into TLC, let's talk about TLC a little bit more. So we saw in the Twin Suns Open Top Cut that Martin Cardin was able to take the championship home, and he was using some very interesting, cool decks. He was one of the few people who brought Ezreal Gangplank, who we only literally saw, I guess, one other person brought in any of these tournaments. So really cool to see that. And then he also had TLC, but he was using an Ionia version of TLC. And then his last deck in his lineup was actually Zoe Vi Victor, which actually got banned in the championship matchup. But once again, a very interesting deck. I think one of the Riot devs was actually using this deck, and that's kind of helped it at least get a little bit more on people's radars, but not a ton. I would love to hear let's start with actually those let's start with those other 2 decks I would like to hear first, and then we can actually go over to TLC because I want to really do a little bit more of a detailed review of that one. Zoe Vi Victor, what are your thoughts there? Is that a legitimate deck? Where are we at with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Obviously, I haven't seen much of that this meta, but in the past expansion, at least of the Felios, I was kind of a pretty big proponent of a PNZ control style deck with Targan. And even though Felios kind of got hit this expansion, its shell sort of still stuck there because it is mainly a control deck with kind of your Targan invoke finishers, or I guess in even like Ruben Zoo's deck, he has like his Subpercival, it's just like the 5/5 elusives hitting through as
Yeah.
well as your star shapings. And I think that your PNZ control cards are quite powerful in this expansion, especially with a lot of people favoring their triple aggro lines. And if you combine your strong PNZ control shell with a kind of Targan invoke shell, have a lot of healing cards, you have a lot of value generation, and you just have a pretty decent win condition of itself. So overall, it's hard to be a bad deck with strong cards from both regions, and so I can see it doing reasonably well here. I guess that it's just not on a lot of people's radar.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good meta call on Martin Cartons. And once you kind of hear your thoughts on it, with saying like, yeah, you were already a proponent for it, and then when you factor in that Targan seems to be in a really strong place due to all the strong cards that you can invoke with Targan, and then obviously all those invokes are helping get Victor more attack, more stats. And then yeah, PNZ has a lot of removals, so that keeps you in a decent place with the an even more decent place against those aggro lineups than you would, I guess, naturally, because Targan obviously doesn't generally have a ton of removal, and when it is with Demacia, it has to do a little bit more combat tricks to get around the aggro rather than straight up removal. So definitely some really solid, some solid opinions that you added onto there. Obviously, the other deck was his as Gangplank deck that was using obviously Dreadway, who we recently saw the buff for in the most recent patch, and also using just using a bunch of cards we actually haven't seen a lot of, and then obviously Gangplank. Really, we have that is not a champion I feel like we've seen at the highest level of competitiveness in quite some bit. What are your thoughts there? Is that where are we at with that deck?
Hmm. All right. This deck I'm a little bit more skeptical on. I
Okay.
think that again the lineup itself seems to kind of be like an anti-aggro kind of target. And then when you have like Kegs, when you have Funsmith, and you have cards like Make It Rain, obviously this is a very powerful way to just like stop aggro in its tracks. And so this is very much so more of a target against aggro decks. But beyond that, if you're not up against some aggro decks, I find this to be a little bit more of a skeptical pick. Obviously, I can't say too much about it because I haven't played it any of myself. I
Yeah.
think I faced something like it once on ladder, but I think the version that he brought seems a lot more refined. And
Okay.
this kind of speaks to how, like in tournaments, especially when you have a one ban format like this,
Yep.
it's a lot easier to bring a deck that has some poor matchups because you have that ban slot, right? And so you can bring a deck that looks a little bit different, but has a good game plan, it has decks that you do want to face into, and something like this can definitely catch people off guard.
Yeah, those are super fair points because I definitely think the catching him off guard, that was a really good point to make, because I think that is part of it. Like, oh, no one else is playing this, didn't expect it, and almost in a sense that lack of expecting it can almost throw someone off more from their game plan than the fact that the deck is even that strong itself. Because yeah, I stand in a similar place as you, where I haven't played the deck myself really, and I haven't faced it enough to really know where it stands. I've seen a lot of YouTube videos coming out on it because obviously Dreadway got his buff, or in a sense a buff. Like he went lower, and now he doesn't work with the SI combo. But nevertheless, he definitely seems like it was a card I was very interested to see if anyone could make work at the highest level in a tournament, and it was interesting to see Martin Cardin. Not only he went 8-0 in the top cut, but he actually won the last game to solidify the championship with that deck. And yeah, just a lot of really interesting cards, and obviously boosting those mystic shots when you got Dreadway down and the other cards down. You can just do a lot of damage straight up to the Nexus. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if other players start to try to give that list a chance. But yeah, I'm kind of in a realm of not knowing how to feel exactly about that deck list. But obviously now we can transition over to TLC. Obviously we've seen a ton of TLC over this weekend, but the one super interesting thing about Martin Carton's TLC list was the fact that he was running it with Ionia, which pretty much no one else is really doing right now. And it seems like an okay way to kind of have a little bit more wiggle room maybe even overall, but definitely at least in the mirror, in my opinion. What were your thoughts on? Have you considered this at all?
Yeah, I actually am. I've played a good amount of TLC this season. And that's mostly been the Shadow Isles variant, and especially when I think the matron combo kind of got really popular. And I will say that I am not the biggest fan of this Ionia version. I get kind of how it works, and I get that it can pull it off at around like a similar turn as the TLC version can. However, what kind of makes this deck look a little bit worse than it is that you just don't have kind of the card draw and the tutors for your combo, right? In the SI version, you have your you what's the four drop? Tip of my tongue.
The
The
four drop.
four
I'm trying to
Beard,
think. Yes, there we
Blobbling
go.
Beard
Yeah.
to tutor out your matrons. And of course, you have Entreat as well, which this deck does have as well. And you also have your SI control tools like the Vile Feast, the Withering Whales, the Vengeance, the Ruination. This deck kind of lacks. I will say that what I think this deck could do better is you have your Icesail Archers, you have your Concussive Palms that you could potentially balance to kind of stall the game a little bit. But I think that overall the SI version can be a little bit stronger. You do have, Homecoming, Go Get It to balance your Watcher, but on the SI version you have what I think is just a better tool as the zero cost fading memories to kind of
Yeah.
duplicate more watchers. So overall, I am again kind of skeptical of the Ionia version. I personally think that the Shadow Isles version is better in most scenarios. But of course, at the end of the day, this is just another Lysandra Trundle deck that if your deck can't really stop the Ion, or if you can't stop the Shadow Isles version, you probably can't really stop the Ionia version as well. And of course, the Ionia version is a little bit more annoying with its denies. You have the homecomings to like really keep your key units alive.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say I'm going to have to back up those points from you because I would say Fading Memories oftentimes feels like one of the most vital cards in this TLC list. Just to ensure you can just keep getting down those ice pillars or keep getting down those watchers if the first one gets stunned or whatever. So yeah, I would have to say that the fact that you lose out on that card makes me a lot more skeptical of this list as well because I'm very high on Fading Memories in this TLC list. And I guess I must have just missed when you were playing TLC because I just hadn't seen a ton of you playing it. But good to know
Hmm.
you got experience with it because I think it's a deck that is going nowhere. And even in our last meta
Right.
assessment, if you guys saw the first episode of this series, I was talking with Sneak GG, who was able to have an undefeated bracket run in the Twin Suns Open, and he was also using TLC. And we were talking about just the sheer amount of people that were using it. And yeah, those numbers have not really changed. There is 21 more TLC decks than there was in the second most used deck in Asol Demacia. So yeah, that deck seems to be going nowhere due to the sheer amount of aggro that is present. But it is good to have it around so that we do have some deck that feels like a really solid answer to aggro. So yeah, it shall be interesting moving forward to see if TLC continues to dominate. I would assume so, because it doesn't seem like anything can really stop it other than banning it. But then you have to play obviously into the aggro. So yeah, it should really be interesting. Asol Demacia, 64 decks using it. That was a deck that we were talking about last week as well, saying to watch out for it because it seemed like a lot of people were already starting to favor it, and it seems like that's just becoming even more true. But I wanted to shift over to our other champion, and because I just obviously sponsoring the Twin Suns podcast tournament, I had a lot of direct insight in that exact tournament. The other one I wanted to talk about, obviously the Dulza Streamer, the one where we're getting our most deck list from. We saw What Am I earlier today take that tournament, and he was able to take that tournament with a TLC lineup. He actually had an atrocity invoke kind of nightfall type of deck. It wasn't really the nightfall aggro list that more people seem to be favoring. And then his last one seemed, I'm pretty sure it was like a Shadow Isles go hard. I don't know exactly the details of what exact cards were in there, but a Shadow Isles go hard type of deck. What are your thoughts there?
Target invokes obviously has the Mountain Scryer to kind of just go all in onto the invokes, get a
Mm-hmm.
big unit, and then have it stick an atrocity down. So it's kind of hard to compare a deck like Nightfall aggro to something like What Am I's list. And of
Yeah.
course, in a lineup sense, I'm not quite sure if it's something you can just simply replace Nightfall with.
Yeah.
So just wanted to make that distinction clear for anyone of you out there.
No, yeah, that's
Um,
very much appreciated. And yeah, what are just like your overall thoughts on that deck? Have you faced it enough, or have you tried to pilot it yourself?
Yeah, it was definitely a deck that was very, very popular last season. I guess pretty popular before Felios came out, and then even after Felios came out, a lot of people were experimenting with the Zoe Felios, pretty much the exact same deck, just replacing Diana with Aphelios.
Yeah.
And even though Aphelios got kind of hit there, the deck overall still kind of does the same thing that it wants to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it just hasn't seen much representation on ladder this season. I haven't seen it at all, pretty much. And What Am I's been playing it for the last couple of months. It's kind of like his deck that he really likes to play, and so no surprise that I think that he's able to pilot it extraordinarily well. And so I think the deck itself is still very strong. You just don't see a lot of people playing it, which I guess is represented by just the sheer amount of different decks out there. And a lot of decks themselves also have little representation, but can still be pretty nice.
Yeah, that's just one thing I wanted to focus on is some of these decks that are seeing some strong performances, but we're not seeing a lot of on ladders. So just to get a little bit more perspective on how good these decks are, considering that most people get their perception of what's good and what's bad through the ladder. So it's good sometimes to be like, well, this isn't really being seen on ladder, but it was able to accomplish such a high feat in tournaments, and that's exactly what we saw with the Centrosity and Vocalist, and then obviously those two unique decks from Martin Cardin, but with a little bit more. We're a little bit more low on those ones, especially because I think it also factors in heavily that Duels of Shurima was a tournament that the whole thing conducted this weekend, but Twin Suns, they had to use the same decks from last weekend, so there wasn't really a progression in the decks that were brought there. So yeah, very interesting to see the Centrosity and Vocalist, and yeah, someone like What Am I, who partakes in so many tournaments and plays on ladder a lot. Yeah, no surprise that he was able to. Once again, I think it's another deck that isn't as straightforward as people would prefer. But if you can pilot it correctly, I think there is a lot of potential with the Atrocity and Vocalist. So, and I was watching a lot of those games, and it was very interesting to see the way he used it. So, really cool stuff. And we'll have to see if the stock of the Atrocity and Invoke deck list starts to go up moving forward. And I assume so, because it seems like we have a very kind of reactive kind of populist rather than proactive. Everyone's like, oh, that did good. Well, time to use it. So we'll see if those numbers start to do a little bit of jumping, and if people start to favor other things that didn't perform as well for them. So yeah, just to kind of wrap things up, I appreciate your time so far. I was thinking we could talk a little bit about what we may think is a maybe underrated and also overrated deck. Do you got kind of any thoughts there, or are you still, or and also just like are we still just figuring out the meta? Or are things kind of, is this pretty much what the meta is? Is it really this open, or are things going to get a little bit more confined into a few couple of decks? Just give me some overall thoughts there. Like, have we figured it out? And then also, do you think any deck is currently being kind of overvalued and undervalued in the meta?
Yeah, for sure. I think the obvious top two decks that I think going to see a lot of moving forward are going to be TLC and Ace of Demacia.
Agreed.
And then the rest of the meta, I think this Duels of Shurima tournament is going to be pretty representative. There's a lot of different decks out there that can do pretty well. And once you have your game plan down, you're either banning TLC, you're either trying to beat Ace of Demacia. There are a lot of different decks out there that can do really well into them. And so I think that there's going to be a really wide diversity of decks as well moving forward. But top two decks you're going to see the most of are probably going to be TLC and Ace of Demacia. For decks that maybe didn't or were a little bit underrepresented, it's hard to say. I think that there are a few different decks out there that in a certain lineup could maybe target TLC. Like if you put Zoe Lee, if you put like Shrima Overwhelm, if you put like either Sand Scouts or like TF Fizz, or not TF Fizz, sorry. Um, what was I looking at? Shima Overwhelm, Deep. Did I say Deep? Shima Overwhelm, Deep, Sand Scouts, maybe Zoe Lee. They all kind of seem to do well into TLC. And if people are always going to be on TLC, maybe you can bring some like anti TLC lineup and kind of just catch people off guard. Because if you can 2-0 TLC and everyone's bringing TLC, then like you can have a decent chance of just catching like a lot of people off guard because you just need a 2-0-1 deck, right? Now, the counterpart to that is TLC is very similar to TF is in the sense that it doesn't really have any decks that hard counter it, except for maybe Sand Scouts, which probably has one of the highest win rates against the deck.
Yeah.
So kind of that strategy is a little bit iffy, and it does get rolled over by a lot of the triple aggro lineups. So it's very much a risk to take. If you don't find TLC in your matchups, then you kind of are left in a tough spot.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Yeah, I would have to say for the most part, I definitely agree with that, especially the fact that TLC and Aesol Demacia are decks that are kind of solidified themselves at the top of the meta. They seem to be pulling away from the pack, and even though we did see a lot more slow burn this weekend, I could see a lot of players kind of reevaluating things moving forward after some of their results this weekend. So we'll have to see exactly what happens there. But yeah, I definitely agree with those two being the current staples. And for the most part, yeah, I think the meta is pretty wide open. I think we're also still really figuring out like what is actually really, really good and what decks work, especially when you even consider all the different iterations of Aesol Demacia that are all seeing at least moderate success. Like we don't even have the most optimized list, I feel, for that deck, or at least not everyone feels it's the most optimized list, even for that deck. So yeah, it's still a lot that we're figuring out. If I did have to say a deck that I think's being a little undervalued, I personally think that there is a way to figure out how to incorporate TFIz a little bit more into lineups. From my recent experiences when I've played against it, and a little bit when I just did a tad little bit of piloting it recently just to kind of get a little bit of a feel of how it feels right now, it does not feel as bad as I feel like some people want to believe it is. So yeah, I could see that deck seeing a little bit of a small uptick at bare minimum moving forward. Yeah, I think that finishes up my take. Did you have any more to add on to what you said, or was that it?
I think that is it. I am excited about the wide variety of decks moving forward, and I know there's some cool tournaments coming up, so there's definitely going to be much more to add to this list.
Absolutely, we got the Mastering Runeterra tournament coming up, which has a lot of money, prize money on the line. So that tournament should be definitely one that everyone has their eyes on this upcoming weekend. I will definitely be partaking in that one. So hopefully I can do all right and just most importantly have a little bit of fun as I'm partaking in that. And then we're inching closer and closer to seasonals as well. So lots of people should be looking to get that tournament practice so that they can feel well prepared as we inch closer to seasonals. So yeah, lots to keep an eye on moving forward. I thought that these stats were very telling that we do have a pretty open meta, and that's just really awesome to see, especially with all the complaining we had prior to the first Shurima patch, that we went from that to this. Definitely something that we got to give a little bit of a round of applause to the devs for, because yeah, that it's not generally the changes that they made. It generally isn't that simple to go from what felt like such a very confined meta to go to something this open. So I'm excited to see what comes moving forward. I think a lot of things haven't been found, and definitely decks can still be further optimized. And yeah, I'm enjoying the fact that also players seem to be willing to experiment with these other decks and all of that. And yes, there's a lot of aggro, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but at the end of the day, there is a lot of different aggro decks, which is good to see. There could just be like one that's very clear the best, but that's not the case. So that's also really awesome to see. So once again, thank you so much for joining us on Meta Assessment. Jasensational, once again, check out the description of this video. All of his socials will be in the description of the video. As you could tell, with all of the amazing insight and and just the detail that he had in this video. Definitely someone that you want to get followed up with if you want some very good commentary from someone as they play through Legends of Runeterra. And yeah, and also someone to keep an eye out for when it comes to these competitions that we have coming up. But yeah, thank you for your time, man. I'm excited as well moving forward, and I guess I'll see all of you guys in the next episode of Meta Assessment. And yeah, once again, as always, the meta thrives with the deepest dives, so we'll continue to provide this for you guys, and I hope you guys can appreciate that. I'll see you in the next one. For now, peace out.